Today, we're gonna have a look at Amish alcohol, specifically their beer. Didn't think you'd see the day when the Amish were knocking back a cold one at the end of a long day, now did you? But the reality is that our friends in dungarees are just as partial to a little sippy sip as we are. And when you really stop to think about it, it shouldn't be that surprising. There are plenty of references in the Bible to wine. From Noah all the way to Jesus turning water into wine for wedding guests. It's all about moderation, and also what denomination that particular Amish man or woman comes from. The new Amish order condemns all forms of alcohol and tobacco, unless it's of course used in the form of medicinal tinctures or during communion. Celebrating communion is a huge deal, and it's celebrated twice a year. Now, wine is made specifically for these occasions. So even if one community is more strict than the other, there will still be alcohol brewed for a specific purpose among all Amish folk, no matter where they are. On the flip side of this buggy wheel are the Amish who are much more relaxed about alcohol consumption. But still, it's all about moderation. No self-respecting family man would ever be caught slurring his words, and you can bet that the church will get involved if it gets out that someone drinks regularly or more than would be culturally acceptable. Now that's not to say that the youngins don't partake in their fair share of hijinks. They're still teenagers after all. In fact, hearing about a kid that got a DUI for driving his buggy and horse off the road isn't rare news at all. Let's just put it this way. The Amish view drinking much more like they do everything else. Moderation, self-control, and the core belief that the community as a whole comes before oneself is what keeps them on the conservative drinker side of the table. And of course, just like us, there are a few of them that overdo it too. But let's get back to the topic of beer for a second. Beer's been around for about 10,000 years. You heard that right. Back when we were still living in caves and hut houses and wearing animal skins, we figured out how to get crap-faced. That's right, sex, booze, and gambling's quite literally the oldest way to make businesses in human history. And lucky for us, the formula for it hasn't really changed all that much since. Like all skills that the Amish value, construction, metalwork, and food production, beer making is a traditional skill that's passed down in families or communities, much like any other skill is. And like all of their other skills, they've capitalized on their craft beers just as much as they have on their cannabis and dairy products. So let's get into the basics of beer making, and how the Amish do it without huge factories with machinery at their disposal. For ingredients, you'll need hops, malted barley, water, and yeast. Now, let's clarify 3 points before moving on. First, various fruits, honey, and herbs can be added to the brew for fruity notes, or to add sweetness, and that sort of thing. Each brewer has their own preferences, but you don't absolutely need those flavor enhancers to make beer. And since the Amish vary widely on their additional flavorings, no single fruit or ingredient is going to be the same in any one community. You'll have to experiment to decide what you like personally for that. Secondly, what even is malted barley? Well, to malt barley, they're soaked in water for a few hours and taken out for a day or two to allow them to sprout. This allows for extra sugars to develop in the grain. Then, the sprouts are placed in a kiln for 48 hours to stop the sprouting process and to dry the grain out. A kiln is a specialized oven, kind of like what's used to bake pottery and ceramics in. And finally, you don't need to use barley and hops. They just happen to be the base ingredients for Amish beer, but any grain will do. Hell, it doesn't need to strictly be a grain at all. It just needs to be capable of fermentation. Sorghum, corn, millet, wheat, rye, oats, and even rice and potatoes can all be used to make beer. Before we get into the actual beer making, we've once again reached that point in the video where we need to remind our viewers, for crying out loud, will you guys subscribe already? Like, share, and comment, because every click from you is what's keeping our team and this channel going strong. And if you want to know more about how the Amish make wine, root beer, or even straight up moonshine, let us know down there in the comment zone, or any other topic that you're curious about. Alright, back to the video. Let's get back to some cold brew crafting. Step 1 is to soak the malted barley in warm water. Now, not boiling water, just hot. Every 6 to 8 hours, the water is drained off to allow for air circulation for a few minutes before that same water is poured back onto the barley. This process takes about 3 days before the enzymes have broken down the starches into fermentable sugars. This water is now called wort. The wort and the barley are then separated one last time, and the wort is transferred to heat. When it's reached a boil, add your hop flours. Again, this is one of those areas where you have to decide how strong you want the flavor to be, so there's no specific measurement, and it's also where any other flavorings like honey or spices are added. Now let it simmer for 90 minutes before removing it from the heat. Now that the wort has cooled completely, the liquid is transferred to a holding container and the yeast is added to the liquid. This can be a glass jar, a stainless steel barrel, or a ceramic crock. It all depends on what the community prefers to use and how much you're making. The trick with the container is to allow it to breathe. The gases need to escape, but the oxygen and bacteria from outside must be kept out. Now we have airlock lids for the more modern and safer ventures. But the old hats, and most of the Amish for that matter, just put a fine cheesecloth over the barrel's opening and tie it around the container's head to keep it nice and tight. The container is then placed in a cool and dark environment that does not experience extreme temperature fluctuations. Ideally, the temperature should be kept around 18 to 24 degrees Celsius, or 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit for our friends in the US of A. The fermentation process needs a steady temperature, and too much heat causes skunky flavors to develop. But too little heat and fermentation doesn't happen at all. So you need to find that temperature sweet spot and the right season to make your beer, because that baby's going to stand there for a while. Over the next few days, the liquid becomes clearer as the sediment settles to the bottom of the barrel, and it'll develop that telltale fermenting foam on the top of the wort. The foam will steadily rise, and then one day it just stops rising, slowly settling back down until there's barely any foam left. Now, this can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. It all just depends on how your ingredients interact with each other. The foam settling down is your cue for the next step. Right now, it tastes like beer already, just a little sharper than you'd expect. But don't worry, you're going to mellow that tang out of it. The liquid is then ladled out into bottles, leaving the bottom layer behind. Those lower few inches is where all the sediment settled in, so be careful not to scoop any into your bottles. The bottles are then sealed and then placed in the pantry for 2 weeks to a month to age. That sharp tang it had when you ladled it out will have been replaced by that telltale bitter bite that a good beer should have. You can drink it right after this aging stage, but personally we'd put it in a fridge for a few hours. Nothing ruins a man's day like having to drink a warm beer. Seriously, let's not commit any truly unforgivable sins after putting in nearly a month and a half's worth of work just to punish yourself with a perfectly good beer that's tepid. Alright, sure. The process is lengthy, but it's not exactly difficult to do. The wide variety of experimentation that beer making allows for makes this a surprisingly fun venture to undertake. Before you know it, you'll be obsessively throwing yourself into flavorings, equipment, and bottling techniques. Why do you think there are so many craft beers on the market nowadays? All of them started out with a guy tinkering in his garage because his wife complained about spending too much money on beer. So he decides to make his own and inevitably ends up getting just as caught up in the fun and the delicious end result that it became a bona fide business. What? You thought the hipsters were the only ones who got pretentious about their craft ale and specialized brews? Hell nah. The Amish were way ahead of those pompous farts with their curled mustaches, and you know what? They're better at it too. But what did you expect? The Buggy Bros have been perfecting their crafts for a few hundred years by now. So why would a channel focused on survival and prepping even bother with beer making techniques at all? Well, besides the fact that it's just dang cool to know about, you can bet your best pair of suspenders that when you're stuck in the middle of a global collapse and your mind is on survival every day, day in, day out, Well, a cold beer's gonna go down pretty damn good after another long day of blood, sweat, and tears, now isn't it? Besides that, even if you're a straight edge, it's still an immensely tradable material when the system's regressed back to bartering for your everyday needs. Like we said before, alcohol is one of the first high-value processed items made by humans, and when things go south, the human race is going to revert back to what we valued most a few hundred years ago. You know, food, shelter, and clothing to cover the necessities. And then, according to the hierarchy of needs, directly after those things, the human vices will be just as highly sought after. So, booze, booty, and high-stakes bets. If you don't have a practical skill to fall back on in the event of total grid collapse, then beer making is a simple enough skill to learn quickly, and that'll be important enough to trade for the things that you need to survive. With all that being said, while you go and get your own craft beer station set up in your garage, just remember to drink responsibly and keep a sober head on your shoulders, just in case the world goes to hell. You think you've had a bad hangover before? I'm sure it can't be as bad as a doomsday hangover. Until next time. This is Threat to Survival. Prepare today. Thrive tomorrow. Embrace the threat to survival.